I ran barefoot into the night with the taste of blood and metal in my mouth, the house still shaking behind me from the door I didn't bother to close. The only thing I carried was a single key and a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating with his messages. My lungs burned. The pavement bit into my feet, and I kept telling myself, "Don't look back. Don't give him your eyes. Don't give him the last word." I wanted to disappear into the dark and take the part of me he kept trying to rename. I wanted to stop hearing his voice in my head counting the ways I'd failed. I wanted silence. I wanted safety. I wanted my daughter. I wanted a kind of love that did not come with instructions. Before we continue, please take a moment to leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. And please hit the like button for me right now and subscribe to my channel. We're building a community of people who know it's never too late to heal and find the truth. Now, back to my story. The night did not save me, but it hid me long enough to get into the car I had parked 3 streets away, because leaving an abuser teaches you to think like a fugitive. I'd been planning for months. Small cash withdrawals, a spare bag in the trunk that looked like a jumble of gym clothes, a contact I hadn't spoken to in years who promised to keep her phone on at midnight. I turned the key, hands shaking, and the engine caught with a soft cough. I sat there for a second, heart thudding, waiting for the porch light to flare, for his shadow to cross the window, for the front door to blast open like a gunshot. Nothing. Only my breath fogging the windshield and the realization that I was both terrified and free. I thought freedom would feel like music. That night, it sounded like tires easing away from a curb. I didn't tell Rachel the plan. She was 16 and angry at me with the full authority of a teenager who had been fed a script and believed it. She loved her father so fiercely it scared me. She believed his explanations and despised my silence, and I can't say I blame her. I'd stopped explaining. When you live with a man who can turn a look into a verdict, you learn to ration the truth in teaspoons, and to a child, that looks like lying. I had tried to show her without showing, little gestures, soft warnings, a glance that begged her to choose warmth over thunder, but I was always the one she decided to freeze out. That night, as the car pulled away, the only thing heavier than fear was the shape of her empty seat. The first apartment was a victory of square footage over dignity. 2 rooms, a thin mattress, and a window that stuck. But the door locked, and no one threw anything. I learned the geography of quiet, how to make the kettle click without a whistle, how to shower with the fan on, how to go to sleep without rehearsing my defense. I kept my phone on the table and flipped it face down so I wouldn't watch the screen glow with his calls. Control doesn't turn off. It rebrands as concern. Where are you? You can't take my daughter from me. You won't last a week. The messages were a net he threw over an ocean. I sat at the table with my hands wrapped around a mug that smelled like nothing and tried to breathe without feeling like I had stolen something I needed to return. I kept going to work. The secret of surviving is scheduling. I showed up in the same sweater and passed small talk like a test I couldn't study for. I answered emails and kept my voice from breaking on the phone. If you had watched me then, you'd say I was managing. The truth is, I was cataloging my life like evidence. I kept receipts. I kept a diary of each time he called, each time he drove past the office, each time a mutual friend let me know he'd asked about me in a tone made of sugar. I learned the difference between a threat and a promise. And I learned that sometimes they are the same sentence wearing different shoes. When he switched tactics, I felt it like a change in weather. The messages softened. He wanted to talk for Rachel's sake. He loved me. He hated me. He respected my choices. He would ruin me. Love, ruin, love again. I had been married to a weatherman who only predicted storms he planned to cause. I did not answer. Silence is not passive. It is work. It is choosing your life again and again when the past keeps offering itself like a discount. The divorce came like a paperwork avalanche, a grinding process that taught me how long a person can hold their breath and still answer questions calmly. He contested everything. He contested the toaster. He contested whether I should be allowed to keep my last name. He contested what I remembered. When we sat in that room with the table between us and the clock above the door, He smiled as if we were here to finalize a vacation. He spoke softly. He said he hoped I would grow. He never yelled in rooms with witnesses. I told the truth in a voice that hated how small it sounded. The judge did not need my volume. She needed my record. I had one. When it was over, I walked into a bright afternoon that felt wrong on my skin and sat in my car until the inside of my mouth tasted like pennies. I cried for what was gone and for what remained, and then I went home to the apartment with the sticky window and slept like I had been permitted to be alive. Rachel refused to see me. She refused to pick up when I called. She refused the little olive branches I kept leaving outside the gates of her belief, the birthday card sent to an address I was not supposed to have, the email sent from an account with a name I hoped would not make her angry. She was a teenager with a fortress and a king. She chose him. What else would she do when the story she lived in told her that loyalty looked like suspicion and love looked like keeping score? I told myself she would understand when she was older. I told myself that truth is patient. I told myself many things because the alternative was a silence I could drown in. Healing did not look like a straight line. It looked like a woman learning her own voice after years of dubbing. I tried therapy and lasted exactly 2 sessions before the old defense rose in my throat, like a beautiful lie. I'm fine. I tried again with a different therapist who asked me what it felt like in my body when I heard his name. My shoulder ached for a week after that question. I rented a different apartment with a balcony that faced a tree and a little bit of sky. I bought a plant and kept it alive. It's ridiculous what feels like an accomplishment when you've been told your instincts are sabotage. I made friends slowly, and I lost a few who preferred the story where I was the villain. I learned to cook one thing well and called it dinner every Wednesday. I found my quiet habits, the ones no one could weaponize, walking before sunset, buying a book and reading it cover to cover without anyone asking me what I learned, leaving my phone in another room without my heart dropping like a glass. Entering peace after chaos is like stepping off a moving train. Everything in you wants to keep running. Then one day I woke up, and the first thought was not him. Then another day, then a week. I wish I could tell you I celebrated, but all I did was breathe and go about the business of a life that finally felt like it belonged to me. That was when I met David. Not like lightning, not like a rom-com, but like a steady light you finally notice has been on all along. He asked me about the book I was holding in line at the coffee shop, and for a reason I still can't explain without sounding sentimental, I told him the truth about what I liked in it, instead of what I thought I should say. He laughed, not at me, but with the kind of generosity that invites you to unfold. He didn't ask for my number. He asked me a question. What do you do on Sundays? I told him the truth there, too. I'm still figuring that out. He smiled like that was the most interesting answer he'd heard all morning and said, "Want to figure out one together?" He did not save me. I was not in the market for another rescuer because I had learned that rescue can be a leash. He just showed up when he said he would, and every time he did, a little knot inside me loosened. He did not push for details I wasn't ready to share. He did not make me confess my past like a price of admission to the present. On our 4th walk, the kind that turns into dinner because you forgot to check your watch, I told him I had been married and that it had been hard in the way people use that word when they mean terrifying. He didn't go wide-eyed or ask for proof. He asked me what I wanted now. That question made me cry because I had been organized around what I feared for so long that want felt like a language. I forgot I spoke. Later. I would love him for knowing that desire and safety are cousins who hold hands at the edge of the same field. The first time he reached for my hand, I flinched, not because of him, but because the body keeps score even when the mind wants to move on. He stopped. He apologized. I apologized for apologizing. We laughed. He said, "Tell me how to be here." I said, "Slowly." He said, "Okay." That is how we built a ritual out of small, consistent gentleness. Coffee on the balcony, walks that ended at a bench, conversations where silence did not mean danger, a world where the door closing was only a door closing. When he met my friends, he didn't perform a version of himself to win anyone. When he met my therapist in a session I asked him to join, he didn't make a speech about how he'd never be like my ex. He listened. When I told him I was not ready for certain places, he offered alternatives. When I told him I wanted to try something new, he asked how it could feel safe. I kept waiting for the catch, the moment the gentle voice would harden and the requests would become commands. It didn't. Gentle stayed gentle. It shouldn't be astonishing, but it was, and I won't pretend it didn't make me fall faster. I married him quietly 2 years after the divorce, in a small room with flowers and 2 friends who cried like they were letting go of a fear they'd held on my behalf. I did not invite my past. I did not invite the story that told me I was only as good as my usefulness. I wore a dress I chose because I liked the way the fabric moved when I walked, and when the officiant asked if I took this man, I said yes to a future that didn't require me to shrink. In the pictures, I don't look like a woman who triumphed. I look like someone who finally exhaled. Rachel did not attend. She sent a message that said, "I hope you're happy," which is the kind of sentence that can bless or bruise. I replied, "I love you," which probably sounded like a strategy to her. It wasn't. It was the only thing I knew to say that didn't make my love look like a bargain. After the wedding, I stood in my kitchen and cut a slice of cake and imagined feeding it to her the way I used to at her birthdays when she was small and let me kiss her hair without wiping it off. I put a slice in a container and froze it like a ritual. I couldn't give up. A cake waiting for a day that may never come. Gerald kept being Gerald. He called when he felt like being tragic and posted pictures of himself at restaurants with captions about resilience. Manipulators are their own PR agencies. He did not threaten anymore. He eluded. He didn't call me names. He praised me for moving on, which in his mouth tasted like implied betrayal. He told mutual acquaintances I had left because I was bored, because I wanted something easier, because I had always been flighty. He didn't hit me in those stories, so they felt like compliments, the way poison can taste sweet if you don't look at the label. Time passed. The apartment became a home that didn't feel like a waiting room. I planted herbs I actually used. I bought a cheap radio and learned the miracle of mornings where music meant music. I learned that a person can be loved without being managed. I learned I could say no and not erupt a volcano. I learned I could say yes and not owe anything more than my yes. The life I built was humble and full in the way a bowl is full when you put exactly what you want in it. Still, there were nights when I woke with my heart galloping because I had dreamed I was back in that house where every hallway felt like a corridor in a trial I could never win. On those nights, David would wake too and ask if I wanted water or a story or silence. He never took me in his arms without asking, and perhaps that's why I finally could go there without flinching. I told him memories like you show someone the scars you're no longer ashamed of but still respect. He held them with care and then put them back where they belonged. That's how you know you're safe. Your pain doesn't become someone else's theater. The day I found out Gerald had died, it felt less like news and more like a shift in barometric pressure. A mutual friend texted me a link to a post. Heart attack, sudden. Tributes below from people who knew a version of him that never came home with us. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. Relief has edges too. When the story ends without your permission, it leaves a dent in the space where you were bracing for impact. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought of a younger me hiding cash under the lining of an old purse, of a younger me sleeping with a chair against the door, of a younger me begging my daughter to believe me without breaking her heart. I thought of Rachel crying in a kitchen where the light looked like a threat because he had made it so. I thought of the time she defended him with the kind of ferocity only a child feels when they believe love is an army. I put the phone down and made tea like a person does in a movie when she needs to put her hands on something warm. David came home and asked how I felt. I told him the truth, complicated. He nodded, sat beside me, and we watched the steam rise like the tail of a quiet animal. He said, "This doesn't erase what you survived." I said, It also doesn't erase what I wanted once. He nodded again. Grief is not just for the person. It's for the life that never got to learn how to be honest. I didn't post a tribute. I didn't dance. I sat in the middle of a room I had chosen and breathed like the world wasn't asking me to perform. The message from Rachel came 3 days later. It was short. Can I come by? The last time she had asked to come by, she was 14 and wanted to pick up a jacket. She left without saying hello. Now she was 26 and had not said my name out loud to me in years. I stared at the text until the letters blurred and then back into focus. I typed, "Yes, I'm home." I erased it. I typed, "Of course." I erased that too because it sounded like a stage direction. I typed, "Yes, I'd love to see you." I hit send and then put the phone face down and prayed the old way you pray when you are trying not to bargain. David squeezed my shoulder and said nothing, and I loved him for that. Before she arrived, I walked through the house and straightened objects that did not need straightening, the way the body prepares a battlefield it hopes will never be used. I imagined 1,000 conversations, each one ending in a different kind of truce. I imagined the worst, because that's how my mind has kept me alive, and then I set it aside, because that's how I wanted to live. I made tea. I considered baking something and then remembered she doesn't like sweet tea cakes anymore because he told her sugar was for people who didn't have self-control. And that small, stupid detail pierced me in a place I hadn't armored. I put out berries instead, which she had always loved as a child, biting into them like they were tiny rubies. When the knock came, I didn't rush. I walked to the door like a person who trusts the floor. I opened it, and there she was, my daughter. The girl who used to fall asleep on my chest, and the young woman who learned to keep her chin tilted at the exact angle he taught her, made her look serious. Her face had the shape of the man I'd once loved, and the softness of the child I would always love. Her eyes didn't know where to land. Mine did, and I put them on her with every ounce of kindness I could gather, without turning it into a performance. We didn't hug. We stood in the doorway, and I said, "Hi," as if that syllable could hold all the years I had not been allowed to say anything else. She nodded, and then she stepped inside, and I closed the door behind her without letting it sound like an ending. She looked around the house like an anthropologist. "Nice place," she said, which is the kind of sentence people say when they need a neutralizer. I offered tea. She nodded. We moved like dancers who had rehearsed the steps for different songs. She didn't cry. I didn't insist. We sat at the table with the berries between us and the clock above the sink, and for a moment it was almost like all the other times I had tried to reach her and failed. Then she said, "He's gone," and her voice cracked on the consonant. I said, "I know," and my voice did not crack because I was holding it together like a glass I didn't trust on the edge of a sink. She didn't look at me when she asked, "Do you miss him?" I said the truest thing I could. "I miss the story where he was a good father to you." She looked at me then, quick and bright and wounded. "He was good to me." I nodded. "Sometimes," I said, because I wasn't going to take every memory she had and set it on fire just to feel warm. If you think this is the moment we solved everything, you don't know how deep narratives go when they're injected into a child's blood. We talked like people who have learned a new language, but still think in the old one. She told me about bills, and about a job that didn't keep its promises, and about how friends show up when death becomes a social event, but forget your name when the casserole dishes are returned. She did not ask about my wedding, and I did not bring it up like a dare. She asked how I was, and I said, "I'm good," and meant it. She nodded like she was filing that away under theories. At some point, David came home and walked into the kitchen like a man who knows he is walking into a delicate room. He smiled. He said hello. He didn't extend his hand. He waited for her to show him how this meeting would go. Rachel nodded and said his name as if it were a word she had read, but never pronounced out loud. I watched them interact and felt two parts of my life lean toward each other like magnets through glass. When she left, it was with the promise to text me later, which is a modern prayer. I stood at the door and watched her walk down the path, and tried not to measure her steps in units of hope. The berries sat untouched in the bowl, and I ate one as if that could put something sweet back into my mouth after a decade of bitterness. David wrapped an arm around me. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like something important moved," I said, "but I don't know if it's closer or farther." He kissed the top of my head the way he does when he wants me to feel the shape of being chosen. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and the darkness felt like an ocean that had swallowed the shore. I thought about the day Rachel was born and how I had counted her fingers and toes and promised secrets to the ceiling about the kind of mother I would be. I thought about the version of me who stayed and the version who left, and the version of me who learned that leaving is not the end, but the doorway to a different kind of work. I thought about the young girl who once loved both her parents without confusion, before he taught her that love is a weapon and you must choose your side. I prayed to a God that felt like breath. May the truth be stronger than the story. May love outlast the lie. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and I traded messages that skimmed the surface like stones. "How are you?" "Fine." "Busy." "Work." We were two people testing the ice and pretending we didn't hear it crack. I didn't push. You can't rush thaw. I sent her a picture of the plant on the balcony that had finally sprouted a new leaf, and she replied with a thumbs up that somehow felt like a handshake. I told myself this is how bridges are built, one plank, then another, with your eyes on the far side and your weight placed gently. Sometimes I still woke to the old fear and remembered the sound of a door closing like a verdict, and sometimes I woke to the silence of a home that didn't ask me to choose between peace and honesty. Sometimes I imagined sitting with Rachel and telling her everything, not to punish, not to win, but to put the truth on the table like bread and say, "Eat with me." Sometimes I imagined she would hear me. Sometimes I imagined she would refuse. On those days, I returned to the small rituals that kept me from turning my hope into a demand. Water the plant, call a friend, read a page, walk a block, breathe. And then one afternoon my phone buzzed, and it was her, not with a text but with a call. She did not start with hello. She said, "Can I stay with you for a while?" The room tilted a degree. I said yes before my mind could list its conditions. She said, "Just for a bit," and I said, "As long as you need." When I hung up, I looked at David, and his face said what I felt. This is a door. We do not know what walks through. I stood in the hallway and looked at the guest room like a stage waiting for a scene that will test the actors. I changed the sheets. I opened the window to let in air that didn't know our history. I put fresh towels on the chair and stepped back and saw not a room, but a question. Maybe this is what courage looks like after the first escape is done, opening a door again when the person on the other side carries the echo of the man you ran from. Maybe this is what love looks like when it refuses to wear armor, making a bed for someone who might break your heart and hoping they will choose to lay down their own weapons. I tell you all of this now, not because I have the ending, but because I learned that beginnings and endings often share a wall. I escaped my abuser, and I rebuilt my life, piece by stubborn piece. I found a love that didn't need me to disappear to feel safe. I learned to trust a home that did not tremble. And now my daughter, my beautiful, furious, complicated daughter, was walking back into my life carrying grief, hunger, and a history written in a hand that was not mine. I knew what I had survived. I did not yet know what I was inviting, and as I waited for her knock again, one question rose like a tide I could not stop. When your past returns wearing the face you love most, will your truth be strong enough to hold the door open without letting the darkness back in? When Rachel moved in, the house changed its temperature. It wasn't something you could measure with a thermometer. It was the kind of cold that lived under words, the kind that made you second guess whether you'd shut a window or just lost the ability to feel warmth. The morning she arrived, she hugged me like someone shaking hands with an obligation. Her arms brushed mine. And that was all. I told myself it was grief, confusion, a daughter learning how to live without the father who taught her every lie about me. I told myself she needed time, but deep down, I could feel something else moving in the walls, something that carried his voice, his habits, his careful cruelty wearing her face. At first, it was small things. She'd forget to come home. She'd sleep until noon, blame the alarm, claim exhaustion. I told David she was adjusting, and he believed me because believing in goodness is what kind men do. He said we just had to give her space. I wanted to believe that, too. I wanted to believe she was still the little girl who once hid under the blanket with me during storms and whispered, "Tell me we're safe." But safety has an expiration date when someone has been trained to weaponize your kindness. The first real crack came one night when she stumbled through the door at 3 a.m., reeking of alcohol and glitter, laughing at something no one else could hear. David sat up, concerned. I met her at the hallway, my voice calm but shaking. "Where were you?" I asked. She rolled her eyes like a teenager again, though she was 26. "Out," she said. "You used to go out, right? Or did Dad make that up too?" My mouth opened, but no words came. She walked past me, the smell of cigarettes clinging to her hair, and I felt something inside me tilt, like the house itself had taken a side. Days blurred. She slept through mornings, ignored chores, left dishes like little declarations of rebellion. David tried to keep the peace, but peace is fragile when one person is rehearsing war. She'd make jokes at my expense, sharp little darts wrapped in laughter. "Mom always gets so tense," she'd say while stirring her coffee. Dad said she used to freak out over the smallest things. Guess he wasn't lying. David would glance at me, unsure whether to laugh or defend me, and I would smile the kind of smile that hides bleeding. I wanted to confront her, but what do you say to a daughter who has turned your scars into evidence against you? Each time I tried, her eyes dared me to prove I wasn't the monster she'd been told I was, so I did what survivors do best. I managed. I swallowed words until they formed stones in my stomach. I cleaned. I cooked. I pretended not to notice when she whispered to David after dinner, or when her laughter sounded like a verdict. Then she started leaving her wallet on the counter. The first time, she asked if I'd seen her cash. I hadn't. She sighed too loudly, as if my honesty inconvenienced her. "Weird," she said, staring at me too long. The second time, she accused me outright. "You didn't happen to borrow anything, did you?" The word borrow twisted like a blade. David was in the room. He froze, eyes bouncing between us. I laughed it off, tried to make it a misunderstanding, but something in his face told me the seed had been planted. Doubt doesn't need water, it grows in silence. I lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, hearing my past whisper, "See? You'll always be the problem." Was she doing this deliberately? Was this grief or inheritance? I wanted to ask her, but she had started avoiding me, slipping out before breakfast, returning when the day was too tired to care. David said, "She's hurting," and I said, "So am I." And that's when I realized we weren't speaking the same language anymore. The next storm hit quietly. She told David I was acting strange. She told him I was taking long walks to meet someone, that I'd been on the phone whispering to a man. I caught the tail end of her conversation once, her voice low and trembling, saying, "I just don't feel safe with her sometimes." Safe from me. The words hit harder than any blow I'd ever taken. I watched David's expression when I walked into the room. Confusion, concern, the tiniest trace of fear. Fear of what, though? Losing her? Losing the picture of who he thought I was? Or maybe the fear that he couldn't tell the difference between the truth and the story he was hearing. I tried to stay calm. I cooked dinner. I smiled. I talked about work. Rachel sat across from me, picking at her food, occasionally glancing at David as if checking whether her performance landed. When she said, "Mom, are you okay? You've been forgetful lately." I dropped my fork. She looked satisfied. David reached for my hand, a gesture meant to soothe, but all I felt was distance. She had built a new stage, and we were her audience. The next few weeks blurred into a loop of tension and apology. She'd provoke me until I snapped, then run to David crying that I was losing control. She'd break things, little things, and blame me. One night, it was a vase, a gift from our wedding. I found it shattered, and before I could ask, she was already trembling, telling David she'd walked in to find me throwing it at the wall. She was yelling, she said, tears glistening like special effects. I think she hates me. I couldn't even defend myself. The words got stuck in my throat, gagged by years of not being believed. David said he didn't know what to think. I said, think about who benefits from this. But that sounded like something a guilty person would say. Do you know what it feels like to watch your own child morph into your abuser's echo? It's like drowning while they argue that you're the one holding them underwater. Every lie she told landed exactly where his fists used to. I started doubting myself. Maybe I had raised my voice. Maybe I had misplaced the money. Trauma plays tricks. It teaches you that peace is suspicious. I looked at the mirror one morning and didn't recognize my own reflection. I looked like someone on trial. David's confusion became distance. He stopped asking me questions directly. He'd text instead. Did you take cash from the drawer? Were you home at 3? Each question felt like a verdict written in lowercase. I tried to show him patience, but patience feels like begging when you're innocent. I began keeping notes again. Times, dates, what she said, what I said. Evidence, because that's what survivors do when they sense history repeating itself. Then came the breaking point, the accusation that almost cost me everything. David had gone on a short business trip. Rachel stayed home with me. The first night was quiet. The second night, she vanished for hours. When she returned, she looked radiant, almost euphoric. I asked where she'd been. Out, she said again. You don't have to know everything, Mom. I went to bed uneasy, that old feeling creeping up my spine, the one that says something has already happened, and you're just waiting for the echo. The next day, David called. His voice was tight. Rachel told me there was a car parked in the driveway last night, he said. She said she heard a man's voice in the house. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. That's not true, I whispered. She's lying. Silence hummed through the phone. He said, I'm sure there's an explanation, but I heard the fracture in his tone. The distance had become a canyon. When he returned home, the air was brittle. Rachel played the part of the concerned daughter perfectly. I didn't want to say anything, but I thought she deserved to know the truth. She cried on his shoulder while I stood there, stunned, feeling like a ghost in my own life. He asked if anyone had been over. I said no. He nodded, but his eyes searched mine like they were reading an unreliable map. Later that night, I heard them talking in the kitchen, their voices low but urgent. Every so often, my name would drift down the hallway, soft and venomous. I pressed a pillow against my face and screamed into it. The sound swallowed whole. For days, he watched me differently. I could feel him measuring my movements, waiting for something, an outburst, a confession, proof that he hadn't been deceived by another liar. Rachel smirked when our eyes met. She didn't have to say anything. I saw Gerald in that smirk, the patience of a man who knew he was winning. One evening, I found Rachel sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, humming. I said her name softly. She looked up, innocent. I asked why she was doing this. She tilted her head. Doing what? I said. You know. She laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut. You always make yourself the victim, Mom. Dad was right. My knees went weak. What did he tell you? She leaned forward. That you ruin everything you touch. That night, I almost packed a bag. I almost left again, but something in me refused. I had already lost too much to the lies of one man. I wasn't going to lose my home to the echo of another. I prayed for clarity, for a sign that I wasn't losing my mind. And maybe prayer works in strange ways, because the truth was already recording itself, quietly, faithfully, in the camera David had installed by the front door months ago after a package theft. I didn't even know it captured sound. David didn't mention it at first. Maybe he didn't want to believe what his eyes might show him. Maybe he was afraid that confirming one truth would unravel the rest. But one night, after another of Rachel's accusations, This time about money missing again, he looked at me differently. Not with suspicion, but with exhaustion. "I need to check something," he said. He disappeared into the study. Minutes passed, then longer. I waited, heart racing. When he came back, he looked pale. "Vivian," he said softly, "come here." I followed him. On the screen there was footage, grainy, time-stamped. It showed Rachel leaving the house late at night, keys in hand. Hours later, returning, stumbling slightly, alone. No strange car, no man, just her. Then another clip, her standing by the counter, taking bills from her own wallet, sliding them behind the toaster, glancing toward the camera as if she wanted to be caught by anything but the truth. Another, her lifting the vase, letting it slip, then stepping back and arranging her expression before calling out for help. My body went cold. It was like watching a ghost reenact my own nightmares. David looked at me, guilt flooding his face. "I didn't want to believe it," he whispered. "I thought maybe she was confused, but—" He didn't finish. I stared at the screen, my daughter's lies looping like a confession she didn't know she'd made. Part of me wanted to run to her room, shake her, demand why. But another part, the part that had survived Gerald, knew the truth. People don't lie like that by accident. They lie because someone taught them that lies are the only language that keeps love. David reached for my hand, but I couldn't feel it. "What do we do?" he asked. The question echoed, but I had no answer. How do you fight a ghost that shares your blood? How do you unteach a poison that was whispered to your child since she could walk? I thought of the little girl who once asked me why I stayed, and the woman who now accused me of everything I escaped. The circle was complete, and I was standing in the center, dizzy with grief. When Rachel came home that night, I looked at her differently. I saw every lie she had carried for years, every wound she mistook for truth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to weep. Instead, I said, "We need to talk." She froze, her eyes darting to David, reading the air. "About what?" I said. "About everything." She tried to play dumb, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her. "You think I'm crazy," she spat. "You think you're perfect?" I said, "No, I think you're hurt. But I also think you've been hurting me." For a moment, I saw the child again, the one who wanted her mother's arms but didn't know how to step forward. Then, as quickly as it came, it vanished. "He was right about you," she said quietly. "You ruin people." The word struck like thunder, but this time I didn't flinch. "Maybe," I said, "but at least I'm not lying anymore." She stormed off, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. David followed her, but I stayed still. I listened to the echo fade and wondered what kind of storm tomorrow would bring. Because truth doesn't fix everything. Sometimes it just exposes the wreckage. I knew we had reached the edge of something irreversible. That night, I lay awake beside David, his hand resting on my shoulder, both of us pretending to sleep. The footage replayed in my mind. Each frame a reminder of how far manipulation can travel, how it doesn't die with the man who started it. I thought about Rachel's words, about Gerald's voice living inside her, about the years I spent trying to protect her from a darkness that eventually wore her skin. I wondered if love could still reach through the walls lies had built. The house was quiet, but inside me, everything was screaming. I had escaped once before by running. Now I would have to escape by staying. Because this time the enemy wasn't outside the door. It was my own daughter carrying the ghost of the man I thought I'd buried forever. And as I stared into the darkness, one question kept me awake until morning. When the person you love becomes the weapon of the one who hurt you most, how do you fight without destroying them too? When morning came, I didn't know if it was light or exhaustion that woke me. The air felt heavy, like it had been holding its breath with me all night. David was still asleep, or pretending to be. I lay there listening to the rhythm of his breathing and the silence between us, an uneasy truce after a night of truth too loud to unhear. Part of me wanted to rewind, to return to before the camera, before the proof, before the house turned into a courtroom. But another part The survivor that had learned the price of denial knew there was no going back. The question that lingered wasn't whether the truth was out. It was, what happens after the lie collapses? Rachel didn't come out of her room that morning. The door stayed shut, her footsteps quiet, the sound of her phone vibrating behind the wood, like a reminder that she still controlled the narrative outside these walls. I moved through the kitchen in silence, making coffee that tasted like nerves. David joined me, careful, measured, as if the floor between us might give way. "We should talk to her," he said. I nodded, but my throat closed around the words. I had waited years to speak my truth, and now, with proof in my hands, I didn't know how to hold it without cutting someone I loved. He said he'd start the conversation. I let him. Maybe I was afraid of what my voice might sound like after all the years it had been silenced by guilt, then accusation, then love that kept asking me to prove itself. I watched through the half-open door as he knocked on hers. She didn't answer. He knocked again. Finally, the door creaked open, and I caught a glimpse of her face, pale, tense, still painted with defiance, but softer around the edges, like she hadn't slept either. "Can we talk?" he asked. She shrugged and stepped aside. I wanted to follow, but I stayed in the hallway, listening to murmurs that rose and fell like waves against glass. Minutes passed. The voices grew louder, then quieter, then loud again, until finally, I heard her say my name, not as an insult, not as an accusation, but as something heavy with meaning. "Tell Mom I want to hear it from her." My heart stuttered. David appeared in the doorway, eyes tired. "She's ready," he said. "Ready? For what, though? Forgiveness? Confession? Another war?" I didn't ask. I walked in before I could lose courage. The room smelled faintly of her perfume and something sharp beneath it. Fear, maybe, or shame. Rachel sat on the bed, eyes fixed on her hands. For a moment I saw the child she once was, the one who used to braid my hair with tiny plastic clips and ask me if love could fix everything. I sat on the edge of the chair across from her, hands clasped so tight I could feel my pulse in my palms. The silence between us was thick. Finally, she spoke. "He told me you left because you didn't care," she whispered. "He said you ran off with David and forgot we existed." I swallowed hard. "And you believed him," I said, not as a question, but as a truth I'd already lived with for a decade. She nodded. "He made it sound so real, and when you didn't fight him, when you didn't come back for me." Her voice cracked. I thought he was right. I wanted to scream that I did come back, that I tried, that every unanswered call, every unopened letter was a wound I carried in silence. But pain doesn't need proof. It just needs space. "Rachel," I said quietly, "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I wanted to stay alive." Her head lifted, eyes glassy. "He wasn't that bad. The old defense, soft, familiar, inherited." "He threw things at me," I said. "He screamed until you hid under your blanket. You remember?" She shook her head, but not in denial, more like she was shaking off the memory that didn't fit the story she'd built to survive him. "He loved me," she whispered, and there it was, the most dangerous truth of all. "Yes," I said, "and he hurt me. Both can be true." She looked away, tears tracing her cheeks. "I wanted you to pay," she said finally. "I wanted you to feel what I felt when you left. He told me you'd never cared, that you'd laugh about him behind his back, that you'd moved on so easily. I thought if I made you miserable, it would make the pain stop." I could hear Gerald in those words, his manipulation, his ability to turn love into punishment. "And did it?" I asked softly. She hesitated. "No," she said. "It made me hate myself. I didn't reach for her. Not yet. The distance between us wasn't ready to close." "Rachel," I said, "your father was sick in ways we'll never fully understand. He taught you to believe pain was proof of love, that control was care, that lying was protection. But he was wrong. And if we don't stop it now, that poison keeps living through us." She wiped her nose, nodded faintly, and whispered, I don't want to be like him. My heart clenched. Then don't, I said. You don't owe his ghost your loyalty. We talked for hours that day, about the past, about the nights she'd pretended not to hear him yelling, about the guilt she'd carried for choosing him. Every confession felt like pulling splinters from the same old wound. David stayed nearby but silent, a witness to 2 lives unbraiding from a web spun years ago. At one point, Rachel looked at him and said, "I'm sorry for what I did to you." He just nodded, eyes soft, and said, "We start over from here." I don't think I've ever loved him more than I did in that moment. But forgiveness isn't instant. It's not a switch you flip. It's a muscle that aches as it rebuilds. The next few weeks were quiet. Rachel moved out for a while, said she needed space to figure things out. I didn't argue. Sometimes distance is the only place healing can start. She found a therapist who specialized in trauma. I found one too. We both needed to stop pretending survival meant we were healed. David joined a support group for partners of abuse survivors. The house began to feel different again. Not empty, but breathing. Still, there were days I walked past her closed door and felt grief bloom like mold in the corners of my heart. What if this was all temporary? What if she decided one day that forgiveness was too heavy? What if the cycle began again, not in this house, but somewhere else, with someone else? Healing teaches you hope, but it never silences fear. I tried not to linger there. Instead, I filled the house with the small sounds of life: boiling water, soft music, laughter that didn't flinch when it echoed. Months passed before Rachel called. Her voice sounded lighter. "Can I come over?" she asked. "Just for dinner." I said yes before she finished the sentence. When she arrived, she looked different, tired but softer, her armor thinner. We cooked together, awkwardly at first. Every movement was careful, like handling glass. But something in her tone had changed. She asked questions instead of accusations. "Did you really try to reach me?" she asked over the sound of sizzling onions. I nodded. "Every year. Birthdays, holidays, anything that gave me an excuse to remind you I was here." She smiled sadly. "He told me you never tried." "He needed you to believe that," I said, "because if you'd known the truth, you might have stopped loving him. And he couldn't stand that." Dinner was quiet but warm. When she laughed at something David said, I felt a weight lift from a place I hadn't realized was still aching. Afterward, she handed me a small box. Inside were the old letters I'd sent, the ones she'd never opened. "I kept them," she said. "I don't know why. Maybe some part of me wanted to believe you'd written something that could make sense of everything." I traced the edges of the envelopes. The ink faded from years of waiting. "You don't have to read them," I said. She smiled. "I already did." That night, after she left, I stood in the kitchen holding the empty box, the smell of her perfume still lingering in the air. I thought about the first night I'd escaped Gerald. The fear, the guilt, the hope that leaving would save us both. I thought about how long it had taken for that hope to come true, how many detours, how many wounds disguised as lessons. Survival had taught me to keep moving, but healing taught me to stop and feel the weight of what I'd carried. Weeks later, Rachel invited me to her therapy session. "My therapist thinks it might help," she said. I hesitated. Therapy meant vulnerability, and I'd spent a lifetime building walls sturdy enough to survive hurricanes. But I went, sitting across from her, in a room filled with soft light and the faint hum of a clock. I listened as she spoke about the manipulation, the guilt, the confusion of loving 2 people who had both felt like home and hell. She talked about the way her father's words had burrowed into her, how even after he died, she still heard him whisper that I was the enemy. I listened until I cried, and then she cried too, and in that moment, something inside me loosened. Maybe redemption wasn't about rewriting the past, but learning to stop bleeding from it. Healing is rarely cinematic. It doesn't happen in grand gestures or perfect apologies. It happens in small, unglamorous moments. A text that says, "Thinking of you." A hug that doesn't feel forced. A meal shared without ghosts at the table. Rachel started coming by more often. Sometimes she brought groceries, sometimes just herself. We didn't talk about the worst nights anymore. We didn't have to. The silence between us was finally the good kind, the kind that holds peace, not secrets. One evening, she came over with a notebook. "I've been writing," she said shyly, "about Dad, about us, about everything." She handed it to me. The first page was a letter addressed to me. It began, "Mom, I used to think forgiveness was weakness. Now I see it's the bravest thing anyone can do." I didn't make it past the second paragraph before tears blurred the words. I hugged her, this time without hesitation, without calculation, without fear that it would be the last time she let me. She hugged me back like someone who had finally learned the difference between holding and gripping. David watched us from the doorway, smiling softly. Later that night, he said, "You did it." I shook my head. "We did it, all of us." He kissed my forehead. "You saved her." I looked at him, the man who had believed me even when he doubted, who had chosen patience over pride. "No," I said quietly. "She saved herself. I just didn't give up on her." Life didn't become perfect after that. Old wounds still pulsed sometimes. There were triggers, memories that ambushed me when I least expected them. But they no longer controlled me. The difference between surviving and healing is simple. In survival, you brace for impact. In healing, you trust the ground beneath you again. Rachel and I kept building trust in small doses. Coffee dates, long drives, quiet talks. She even started volunteering with a local women's shelter. "If I can help one person escape what you escaped," she told me once, "maybe it means something." I saw myself in her more each day, the strength, the stubbornness, the fight. But this time, those traits weren't weapons, they were wings. Watching her rebuild her life was like watching the girl she once was finally come home. She found new friends, new interests, even started dating someone kind, someone patient. The first time she told me about him, her voice trembled. "I don't know if I can trust myself," she said. "You can," I told her, "because you're not listening to his voice anymore. You're listening to your own." One evening, months later, she came over for dinner. The sun was setting, painting the house gold. She helped me water the garden, the same one that had wilted during the worst years. "You really love these flowers," she said. "They remind me that things can bloom again, even after being cut down," I replied. She smiled, understanding. "Like us." I nodded. "Exactly like us." As we sat together, the quiet around us felt earned. I realized that revenge stories don't always end with destruction. Sometimes the real revenge is rebuilding the life they tried to destroy, and doing it with grace. Gerald's legacy ended with us. The chain broke the day we chose healing over hate. Still, sometimes at night, when the house is dark and the world is quiet, I think about him, not with love, not even with anger, but with a strange kind of acceptance. I think about the power he once had and how little it matters now. He's a ghost that no longer haunts me, only reminds me of what I survived. And I think about Rachel, the living proof that even poisoned roots can grow something pure again. It's been 2 years since that day we watched the footage, 2 years since the truth shattered the illusion that nearly tore us apart. We still talk about him sometimes, not as a wound, but as a warning. I've learned that silence is not peace, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means refusing to let the past dictate who you become. Now, when I tell my story, it's not from a place of pain but purpose. I tell it because somewhere there's another woman sitting in a quiet house, convincing herself she deserves the chaos she's in. I tell it because there's a daughter believing her father's version of a story she hasn't heard both sides of. I tell it because healing isn't a straight line. It's a maze. And sometimes you need someone who's been there to light the way. Sometimes I still catch Rachel watching me the way you look at something fragile you once broke and can't believe still exists. And sometimes I catch myself doing the same to her. We're learning to see each other without the ghosts in between. Not long ago, she called me just to say, "Mom, thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled through tears. I never could. I said. You're my daughter. She laughed softly. Yeah, I know. I'm finally starting to believe it. The past doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes something you carry differently, like a scar that no longer aches, but reminds you where you've been. I used to think survival meant escaping him. Now I know survival meant facing the parts of him that tried to live on through us, and choosing love anyway. So when people ask how I found peace after all that chaos, I tell them the truth. Peace wasn't given to me. I built it, brick by brick, truth by truth, apology by apology. And if you're listening to my story right now wondering if you can ever do the same, yes, you can. You don't need their permission. You don't need their approval. You just need to choose yourself one quiet morning at a time. Because here's the thing about healing from the kind of love that almost killed you. It teaches you to redefine victory. My victory wasn't watching him die. It was watching my daughter live again. It was watching her smile without guilt. It was finally believing that I deserved the calm that followed the storm. And maybe, just maybe, you're standing at your own doorway, waiting to decide if you'll take that first step. Maybe your truth feels too heavy, your heart too tired. But let me ask you, what if this pain isn't the ending? What if it's the beginning of your freedom? If you've made it this far, tell me, what would you do if the person who once broke you gave you the chance to heal through their memory? Would you take it, or would you let the past keep writing your story? I want to know. Share it. Tell me in the comments. Tell someone you trust. Tell the world. Because sometimes the act of telling is the start of reclaiming your voice. And as for me, I escaped my abuser. I survived his lies. I faced the weapon he left behind and turned it back into love. My name is Vivian, and this, finally, is my peace. Thank you for listening to my story.